first time in 75 years, civil rights legislation passed, and there was a move to desegregate the schools in the South. Because again, schooling was segregated. The argument being, well, there is black schools and there are white schools, they're equal. Of course they weren't equal at all. The white schools had 150 times the investments per pupil than the black schools did. That's the fact. And of course, the federal government moved to desegregate the schools. Now you'd think, wouldn't you, a simple measure in an American democracy of desegregated schooling would be fairly straightforward. Not at all. People will know that when it took place in Little Rock, Arkansas, the first black students to attend a mixed school had to be accompanied by armed guards. National Guardsmen had to guard a student, a school kid, walking into school with weapons. Why? Because a baying mob of white racists were gathered outside of the school to try to stop him going in. And that was in America in the 1950s. From the point of view of Martin Luther King, who by that time had become part of the Southern Christian Christian Leadership Council, which provided the leadership to the civil rights movements, this idea of non-violent direct action was seen as the way in which the civil rights movement could put moral pressure on the authorities to change their laws. And they modelled themselves on Gandhi, you know, the non-violent direct action, which had seen, or allegedly had seen Britain kicked out of occupation of India. Now I want to say something about that, because this is a meeting of a Socialist Workers' Party. We're a revolutionary organisation. We understand the nature of the state, we understand that the state is violent and oppressive, and we don't believe that the state and the ruling class are simply going to roll over and die because we sing Kumbaya. Yeah? But if anybody is under any impression that a non-violent direct action campaign in the southern states of America in the 1950s was somehow a soft option, think again. Martin Luther King had his house bombed. People were murdered. People were attacked. When people decided that they were going to desegregate some of the eating establishments, Woolworths in particular, I mean Woolworths doesn't exist anymore now, does it, thank God, but at that time they had segregated food counters, and a number of black students and white students said, to hell with that, we're going to go in and we're going to sit down, we're going to order a coffee. They sat there, not only were they not served because they were black, but they were attacked, they were beaten, they were punched, they had hot boiling water poured over them by white racists. They didn't fight back because their view was we would hold moral authority by not resisting. But let's be absolutely clear, it was an incredibly brave tactic by these people. I think nobody should ever denigrate people who were prepared to do that because it was putting their lives on the line. Now, there were, of course, people who said, well, at the end of the day, we are asking for civil rights, the basic rights that people enjoy in lots of parts of the world, the right to vote, the right to free assembly, the right to go into a cafe and order a cup of coffee. We want those rights. I mean, people might remember as well a famous episode where Muhammad Ali described how after he'd won the gold medal in the boxing for America in 1960, he put it round his neck and he went back home and he went to get himself a hamburger. He was the Olympic champion. He just won for America and he was refused service because he was black. And he notably said he took his medal off and chucked it in the river and said to hell with that, and that changed him fundamentally. Now what began to emerge was a quite radical campaign of non-violent direct action. The students organised, the Student National Council began to form, which saw itself really as the vanguard of the struggle. They sent what was known as freedom riders into the South, people who would go down, many of them young white students who would go down and stand and sit with their black brothers and sisters to demonstrate directly that they were not prepared to put up with segregation. And again, they were met with the most horrendous violence. I mean, again, I don't know if people, I presume people might have seen the film Mississippi Burning. It's a good film and a bad film. Yeah? It's a bad film because it portrays the FBI as somehow the good guys. The FBI were in no way, shape or form the good guys. Yeah? But it's a good film because it gives you a sense of the horror of the racism, the collusion of the police in the South. The fact that these people were able to get away with it. The only reason there was a national outcry, of course, was because two of the students who were murdered, there were 3 students murdered, were white. And that alerted the authorities that something needed to be done. Now, King and the leadership of the civil rights movement looked to Kennedy. When Kennedy was elected, John F. Kennedy in 1960, this so-called liberal who would bring about change from above. The reality is, and let's be clear, JFK was no liberal. I mean, his politics would put him on the right of the Tory party, by the way. It wouldn't put him, he wasn't Jeremy Corbyn, let's be clear. And he didn't like King. He was suspicious. He thought he was organising, he was being manipulated by the communists. So he had the FBI spy on him. But such was the movement, such was the way in which, and I've got some figures here which I might give you later, the number of people involved were running to the tens of thousands. Tens of thousands of people were involved. 20,000 people were arrested. You know, 20,000 involved in civil rights campaigns up and throughout the southern states. And this had an impact. And it had an impact to the extent whereby they decided that, and King decided, they would mount an election campaign, a voter registration campaign, in a place called Selma, Alabama. And they picked Selma, Alabama for a particular reason. Selma, Alabama was the fiefdom of a man called Bull Connor. Bull Connor was the local sheriff. He was a vicious, hardline racist. Every time black people attempted to register to vote, he would have his officers stand with bullwhips on the steps of County Hall and beat people who attempted to register to vote in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And so they decided they would have a large civil rights demonstration in Selma, Alabama. And it was an occasion where it was led by church leaders, black and white, marching together, singing hymns. They did sing Kumbaya. And what happened to them? Well, people will have seen it. I'm sure most people will have seen it. They were beaten off the streets. Dogs were set on them. They had hoses set on them, water hoses, to drive them off the streets. They were clubbed and beaten. These were church leaders. These weren't revolutionaries. And those pictures were beamed around the world, and they shocked and horrified the world. And it led to a movement of legal desegregation. They decided to pass the Civil Rights Act, and they decided enough was enough. They were going to shift, because this was giving America an extremely bad name. And remember, this was at a time when many states around the world were looking to break away from colonialism. And of course, at that time, there were 2 major competing powers. There was Russia and there was America. America tried to present itself as the great democracy. Didn't look very good for their project of democracy, where the world could see black people demanding the right to vote being beaten off the streets. Now, whilst that was happening and whilst that took place, a lot of people in the black movement, in the civil rights movement, were beginning to question whether or not, despite all the legislation that was being passed, there was any significant change. Because yes, legislation was passed, but it didn't fundamentally alter the position of black people. And you saw the emergence of a much more militant type of resistance to racism, particularly once the civil rights legislation and it got rid of the legal discrimination and segregation in the South, the focus then moved to the north of America, where actually the majority of black people lived. There was no legal segregation, but there was economic segregation. Black people had the worst houses, the worst jobs, the lowest pay. They lived in the worst conditions, and on top of that they had daily police brutality. And a new layer of black activists began to emerge, predominantly around the ideas of Malcolm X. Now Malcolm X is often portrayed as the revolutionary and King as the reformist. I want to say that's not strictly true, and as I'll try to explain, and I'll use some quotes from King, that's a disservice to Martin Luther King, but for Malcolm X's position was quite clear. He said, listen, we're not violent. And his famous phrase was, however, if somebody lays a hand on you, send him to the cemetery. He says, we ain't going to put up with turning the other cheek. And that had a resonance with people. Why the hell should people put up with this shit? It's about time that we fought back. And you had people like Stokely Carmichael, who was later to form the one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, you know, saying, we're not having it. We've had enough of this. We want to resist. We want to fight back. And when the movement began to shift to the north, it was inevitable that economic issues, not simply civil rights issues, would come to the fore when it came to the question of the position of black people. And of course King was responsive to that. He understood that. And what began to develop really with Martin Luther King was a shift in his thinking. He began to become far more radical. Now, you know, he's a church figure, and people say, well, you know, it was his religion. I'll say this. I actually think it was the material conditions that he encountered which changed him. So in other words, it wasn't the religious side of it, what will come hereafter. It was about what was happening here and now, which made him understand that actually you needed to move beyond simply putting demands on the people at the top. It's about time that people started to fight for things from below. And of course, and I'll give you some of his quotes, he began to understand and talk about the position of black people in America being one which is determined by economics. And if I can see in me £2.99 glasses from B&M in this light, and I do want people to understand the language he uses here, by the way. It's the language of the time, it's not the language we use. I thought I was going to be shot then. He said, he wrote this article in 1967. This is what he said. He said of black people, he says, the Negro still lives in the basement of the Great Society. He is still at the bottom, despite the few have penetrated to slightly higher levels. Even where the door's been forced partially open, mobility for the Negro is still sharply restricted. There is often no bottom at which to start. And where there is, there's almost no room at the top. In consequence, Negroes are still impoverished aliens in an affluent society. They are too poor even to rise with the society, too impoverished by the ages to be able to ascend by using their own resources. And the Negro did not get this himself, it was done to him. For more than half of his American history, he was enslaved. Yet he built the spanning bridges and the grand mansions, the sturdy docks and the stout factories of the South. His unpaid labour made cotton king and established America as a significant nation in international commerce. Even after his release from chattel slavery, the nation grew over him, submerging him. It became the richest, most powerful society in the history of man, but it left the Negro far behind. So he understood that actually American society was inherently unequal and black people were at the bottom of the pile. And nevertheless, he understood therefore that it was a question of resisting that inequality, not simply demanding formal equality. That wasn't enough. He understood they needed to go beyond simply legislation. And of course, as he was writing, and in the mid-1960s, there was a series of explosions in the major cities, revolts. So after, for example, Malcolm X was killed, was assassinated in 1965, there was a series of riots. And I say riots, I don't know if anybody's ever, I'll tell, I've been involved in riots, I think many other people have. We think they're riots. I'll tell you what a riot is. A riot's what took place in America in the 1960s. I'll give you a few examples of what went on. Yes. The Watts riot of 1965. 50 square miles of Los Angeles, 34 deaths, 4,200 arrested, 600 buildings damaged at a cost of at least 100 million. 7,000 people were involved, and another one, a journalist, estimated that up to 65,000 people were involved. In Detroit in 1967, and I don't know, there's a film out at the moment called Detroit, I've seen it. You get no idea of the scale of the Detroit riots. You get a sense of the racism of the police. The Detroit uprising of 1967 left 5,000 people homeless, 1,300 buildings destroyed, 2,700 buildings looted. The total cost was calculated at $500 million. 3,800 people were arrested. This is in one city. 347 were injured and 43 died. And one young girl was killed when a tank opened fire on the tenement block that she was living in, one young black girl. These were urban insurrections, and Martin Luther King was at the centre of that, and he understood what was happening. But he also understood that there was another matter that was taking place as well, and that was the Vietnam War. Because by the mid-1960s, America was fully involved in the Vietnam War. The American army was a draft army made up predominantly of working class people, working class men, and disproportionately large numbers of black men. And this is what King had to say. He said, and I say to you today, that if our nation can spend $35 billion a year to fight an unjust evil war in Vietnam, and $20 billion to put a man on the moon, it can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet right here on earth. He understood the link between war and oppression, between war and capitalism, between capitalism and racism. He was beginning to understand that, and when he did so, incidentally, he began to lose a lot of his erstwhile liberal allies who began to turn their backs on him. And so therefore you had this situation where, as I say, King was moving quite rapidly to the left and he decided that it was important therefore that he linked up the economic issues that faced black people with the economic problems that white working class people felt. So therefore he decided on a Poor People's March on Washington. The previous march on Washington, the one with a famous speech, was about civil rights. This time it would be a Poor People's March in which white poor and Latino poor would join with black poor people to march to demand economic equality. And he recognised it. He said, actually there are more poor white people in America than black. And he also said something very, very important. When he was talking about white supremacy, he says white supremacy, he said it can feed the ego, but it can't feed the belly. In other words, racism doesn't help white people. It might make them feel a bit better than black people, but it certainly doesn't put food on the table. If anything, the other way around, actually. Because if you look to the southern states, where racism was most, pernicious, most divisive, white workers there, on average, earned less than black workers doing the same job in the north. Why? Because that division between black and white enabled the boss to rule over both. And as I say, King began to understand that. And I know my time's up. I've been told to sum up, I've never been told your time's up. That does worry me a little. and as Martin, I sometimes get mixed up. I say Martin King or Martin Luther King. As Malcolm X would probably say, yeah, I'll come to that in a minute. I'll finish with this because it is towards the end of his life. He died in 1968. He was assassinated in 1968, and I think you understand his evolution when you understand where and why he was killed. It was quite apparent by late 1968 that there was a beginning to come together of the civil rights movement, the fight against racism, with the anti-Vietnam movement, with a rising women's movement, and also with revolts in the colleges. And also, it's got to be said, with an emergence of the American working class and the auto factories in particular. And King went, there was a dispute that broke out in Memphis amongst janitors, basically bin men. And they were demanding union rights. They were refused the right to be in a union. And an incident occurred where 2 black janitors were killed when they tried to shelter in their sanitation truck, and there was a short and the truck came on, the crusher came on and crushed them. The reason there was sheltering in that truck is because they weren't allowed to have brakes anywhere else other than near their trucks. So when it was raining, they took shelter in the back of the truck. That led to a dispute where 1,400 sanitation workers came out on strike for union recognition. And King went up to give his support and solidarity to this group of workers. And he made the final speech of his life the night before he was killed. And I want to read you this. And it is, without doubt, and I mean, it's always incredibly difficult when you have to quote Martin Luther King, because he was such an incredible orator, you know, the most incredible orator. And so when you quote him, you're thinking, God, I'm speaking the words of a man who's so incredibly powerful. But he spoke, and this is what he said. He said, and incidentally, this was after he called in the meeting. It was a mass meeting in the church, and he said, well, I think you need to escalate this dispute. I think you need to call a general work stoppage in the city. That's what he said. Let's spread it. So he wasn't just saying, you know, well done. He went much further. But this is what he said. He said, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. And I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. He knew, I think he knew, that his time was up. I think he knew that he was going to be killed at some stage. That's how American society quite often deals with the people who put up resistance. But to his last, he stood with workers in a dispute. He was moving to the left on a massive scale. He became symbolic of the need to link together the fight against war, the fight against oppression, and the fight for workers' rights. I think, and I'll finish with this, as socialists, we all have a dream, don't we? We have a dream. You know, if you don't dream about the type of world you want, I'll question why you're a socialist in the first place. We want a world without oppression, without racism, without violence and war, where we don't have hunger, we don't have starvation, we don't have economic and environmental deprivation. We want a world in which every man, woman and child can live as an equal and enjoy the fruits of this planet. That's the vision King had. He, in the end, was killed because he had that dream. I think if we are to honour the legacy of him and those who fought alongside him to realise that dream, we have to link up the struggles just as he did when he died. That is a fight not simply against racism, but against the system that produces it in the first place, and that's why we need to have a revolution.